Now to Geneva, where a 6-month interim deal between Iran and 6 world powers reached in the small hours of Sunday that curbs Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. And the preliminary agreements could have far-reaching consequences, including an end to the era of tension and stalled diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. And what's more, the very geopolitical makeup of the entire Middle East region could undergo serious and strategic shifts in power. The deal can be interpreted in many ways, but was marked by serious compromises, including America's acquiescence to, quote, a mutually defined enrichment program for Iran, and on the flip side, a commitment from Iran that, quote, under no circumstance will it ever seek or develop any nuclear weapons. In Geneva, Iran's foreign minister reiterated the fact that Iran is not pursuing a bomb, but he did say this.
Current agreement, the current plan of action, as we call it, in two distinct places, has a very clear reference to the fact that Iranian enrichment program will continue and will be a part of any agreement, now and in the future.
What happened in Geneva is extraordinary, to say the very least, and is most certainly historic. And joining us to discuss this is Reza Marashi, Research Director of the National Iranian-American Council in Washington, D.C., and Rami Khouri, joining us over the phone, Director of the Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University in Beirut. Gentlemen, I just want to go through some of the major takeaways from the deal in Geneva before we get to the discussion. Iran has agreed to halt all enrichment above 5%, a level consistent with producing fuel for civil purposes, and to neutralize its entire stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. This means its 20% stockpile will need to be diluted back down to 5% or converted into fuel rods, which makes reconversion impossible. Now, Iran will also stop installation of new centrifuges, halt construction at the Arak heavy water reactor, and intensify international inspections. In return, Iran gets what is being called limited temporary reversible sanctions relief, worth about $6 billion to $7 billion over the 6 months. Now, Rami, you tweeted earlier, and of course you have been there in Geneva. You've also been tweeting since the event, but this was one that stood out. Oh, forgive me, Rami, of course you weren't there, but this tweet stood out. You said, expect adjustments in resistance and deterrence front of Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, now that Iran's deals with a key state is being resisted and deterred. What did you mean by this, Rami, and why is that significant?
Well, there's been a very strong and actually quite an effective alliance between Iran, the Syrian government, and Hezbollah, and occasionally there's other groups that joined here and there around the region. But those three created what they call the resistance and deterrence front. And what they say they are resisting and deterring is Israeli aggression and occupation and attacks and colonization, what they see as American threats to the region in various forms, including through Israel, and the very conservative policies of some of the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and others in terms of supporting movements that are critical of the deterrence and resistance front, right? So anti-Hezbollah people and things like that. So, suddenly now one of the key people being resisted, which is the United States government, is negotiating directly with and making a deal with the strongest member of this deterrence and resistance front. So I think we're in for a significant change in the geopolitical strategic dynamics of the region. I keep it in kind of broad, vague terms like that because it's very hard to predict anything specific. I've even said, I've written on record that I think you should anticipate very soon Saudi-Iranian contacts. I mean, all this talk about the Saudis and the Iranians hating each other and fearing each other and threatening both to be hegemons in the region, this is really exaggerated talk. I mean, these are two important players in the region, have been for many years. They have different kinds of power and authority and legitimacy and influence. And they're both very big players in the region, as is Turkey, and they have to play their role and be respected. And they realize, I think now, that things are changing between Iran and the West, and therefore they better
change as well.
Themselves.
Right.
Yeah, they better change themselves.
And with that in mind, Rami, laid out perhaps how diplomacy works, Riza, and I want to draw attention to one of your tweets. You put it very simply here, saying diplomacy works retweeting the BBC World, where they're talking about the EU sanctions on Iran could very well be lifted as early as next month. Based on what we just heard Rami outline in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran and that perceived or real rivalry and what might come of that as a result of this example of diplomacy working, what are your thoughts, Riza, in terms of the significance beyond the effect this has on the Iranian people? What's the significance for the region?
The significance for the region is, this just goes to show that diplomacy is a tool, and it's only as effective as the political leaders who are using it or who are not using it. So as it pertains to regional stability, regional security, preventing an increase in conflict and an increase in stability for innocent people, what we're seeing now is political leaders who are willing to take risks for peace. It's something that's been absent from this part of the world, and even in the United States itself, frankly, as it pertains to foreign policy, for too long. And sometimes when a conflict gets to the point where you could reach a war, that sharpens the focus of political leaders, and I think that's why they're doubling down on diplomacy.
And perhaps that's most symbolized or most clearly seen, at least it was for me this weekend, in this retweet by the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, of the Department of State Twitter account. This is a tweet written by John Kerry saying the agreement in Geneva is a first step that makes the world safer. More work is left to be done, though.